Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the Wright Flyer. This is your captain speaking, and I want to welcome you to our state-of-the-art radio program. This, of course, is a solo flight, which means it's a bit special and different from the usual broadcasts that we do, and now that you're aboard, please be seated, kick back, make yourself comfortable. We've taxied to the departure lane and are awaiting takeoff clearance from air traffic control. While they go through that mindless, bureaucratic red tape and regimentation, I'm going to go ahead and delve into the pre-flight checklist because there's a lot of news and information to get to before I may indulge you with your in-flight entertainment. This episode is going to focus on the issue of separation of church and state with respect to the First Amendment freedom of religion. Now, the reason I bring this up is because there is a major story happening in Oklahoma where they are removing a statue of the Ten Commandments from a government property because many have, or not many, but some have complained that it infringes their freedom of religion. Now, this is an issue that has been with us at least for the past 60 years. Religious liberty, of course, is part of the First Amendment to the Bill of Rights, or to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights being the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution. But what has happened is that there has been a misinterpretation of what was intended by the First Amendment when it says that Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of a religion or abridging the free exercise thereof. Now, normally, the courts approach this in a two-tiered fashion, one being a religious liberty issue, the other being a free exercise of religion. And what it means is that you have to bring a separate type of claim. But where I have a problem with what has been happening, especially with these cases like in Oklahoma or in the case of Van Orden v. Perry back in 2005, is that there is this notion that you cannot have religious displays whatsoever on governmental property. That, of course, is actually contrary to the original intent of the Founding Fathers. And this goes into play with James Madison, who is considered the father of the Constitution and who exerted considerable influence over the First Amendment. Now, what has happened is the Supreme Court, through judicial review, has tried to make it be that there is strict separation of church and state. And that's just not quite true. The reason that the Founding Fathers included the restriction on establishing a state religion goes to the root of a problem that existed when America was still a colony of Great Britain. That is, England had an established church, the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. And, in fact, one of the early episodes in James Madison's life that had a profound impact upon him and influenced his thinking was where he witnessed Baptists being imprisoned solely for worshiping in their own church, not being a part of the official state religion. And that was what he found so abhorrent. He wished to avoid that, and he wanted to ensure that the United States would be a country where you were free to practice your religion without fear of governmental reprisal. It did not, however, follow from his line of thinking that we needed to abolish religious symbols from government sites or buildings. And the clearest example that we have of this line of thinking can be seen with the traditional prayer that opens every session of Congress. So if there was strict separation of church and state, and that is what the Founding Fathers had intended, they wouldn't have allowed that to be the case, meaning starting each session of Congress with the prayer, the traditional prayer. And another part that's important to take from this is you can't really have strict, absolute separation of church and state, because if that were the case, it would be allowable for the government to abridge the free exercise of religion. And that is why that part is actually included in the First Amendment. The Founding Fathers were attempting to prevent the right from being misconstrued or construed in such a way that a tyranny of the minority could be created. And what we're seeing with issues like this, where they are removing religious monuments from these government sites, is that they are actually abridging on the free exercise of religion, because these monuments are not stating that there is an official religion in the United States. It's just going off of the Judeo-Christian principles. And yes, the United States government has a foundation, a firm foundation in these principles, because they tie into the natural law theory, the Enlightenment thinking that is part of our Constitution. It is exactly what inspired our Constitution, because you cannot have unalienable rights, or rights that cannot be taken away from you, if you have a strict separation of powers, or not of powers, but of church and state, because what that entails is that the government is the supreme arbiter of what rights you have or do not have, which simply isn't the case, because that does not reflect the actual intentions of the Founding Fathers. Now, what's also important to keep in mind when analyzing this issue is the context in which the monument was being used. And I believe that the monument in question for Oklahoma was put in place back in 2012, and what the monument's creator said was he had not intended it to be a religious monument, but a historical context to law. And if you really step back and think about it for a moment, the Ten Commandments are a historical depiction of law, because it is a historical thing. It did exist. It still exists. And it's still good and sound law if you think about most of the principles that are within it. And therefore, it has been used as a historical reference and in a historical context. You'll find it adorning courthouses across this country. It's in the United States Supreme Court. You can find it in the halls of Congress, both in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, as well as depictions of the Code of Hammurabi. And if you take into consideration the way that ancient law worked, the ancient world didn't separate church and state. They were considered one, because the gods were the ones that would enforce any type of binding legal agreement that was entered into by various parties. And that is just an integral part of how the law worked at that time. the notion of separation of church and state is born from an Enlightenment era philosophy, which certainly is reflexive of what the Founding Fathers believed, because our Constitution, being a natural law document, is also inspired by the Enlightenment era thinking. And it really was a great sort of thought process that went into this. It was not something that they just saw as being beneficial for ensuring that intolerance didn't occur. No, they saw it as an ability for the individual who holds complete sovereignty to be able to express themselves and their religion and their devotion to their Creator in a free fashion, but also to prevent a tyranny of the minority, which is what we're seeing with these radical minority groups that are attempting to strip every reference to religion from government property here in the United States. And so when you see this type of strict separation of church and state, what you're seeing is an attempt for a minority to control the views and beliefs of the majority and to inhibit the free exercise of religion. And so this type of entanglement we're seeing from these kind of radical atheist groups is actually contrary to the Constitution itself. And it's that sort of hypocritical type of mentality that we see from the radical left in this country that makes this all the more dubious and should raise alarms for American citizens all over, because it is encroaching upon our individual liberties. The true point of view of the Founding Fathers can be found in letters from them to other Founding Fathers and to other men of influence at the time, which clearly state what they were intending to do with it. And James Madison, being the father of the Constitution, is the one that I really want to look to. And we see from a letter that he had sent to William Bradford in April 1st of 1774. So we're actually at a point before the ratification of the Constitution and later the Bill of Rights. But he said that religion, or the duty we owe to our Creator, and the manner of discharging it, being under the direction of reason and conviction only, not of violence or compulsion, all men are equally entitled to the full and free exercise of it according to the dictates of conscience. Now, I want to stop and focus on what he's saying here, because it is a truly profound statement. It is saying that the type of oppression that you saw in England against those who did not adhere to or follow the edicts of the Church of England should not be allowed, because it goes against the natural law. Now, you can see that by his mentioning of being under the direction of reason and conviction only. Reason and conviction are two parts of natural law. It follows to reason that the people are the absolute sovereigns over government, because that is what is naturally written onto the hearts of men, and that they are endowed by their Creator with unalienable rights. And you can see why, when you try and abridge the free exercise of religion, you start to run into this problem of despotism and tyranny. And so we have to be vigilant in the way that we look at this, and we have to ensure that a tyranny of the minority does not establish itself or gain a foothold, because this is one of those progressive little steps of slowly chipping away at all of our liberties and unalienable rights. And if you stop and think again about what unalienable actually means, it means that government is not authorized to take away those rights or to inhibit them in any form or fashion. We can also see that James Madison stated in the amendments to the Virginian Declaration of Rights from June of 1776, he says, "It is the duty of every man to render to the Creator such homage, and such only as he believes to be acceptable to him. This duty is precedent both in order of time and in degree of obligation to the claims of civil society." So here, what we're seeing is he is saying that you have to have these critical aspects of natural law as envisioned by the Creator and the rights that are endowed to you by the Creator in order to move society forward. But it also cannot be such that it imposes upon an individual to express a certain religious view. But if you notice, he said that it's still according to the dictates not only of conscience from the letter from 1774, but also to the claims of civil society. Now, when you look at civil society, that means that there has to be a code of conduct. That code of conduct, of course, is seen in the embodiment of the United States Constitution. That is the absolute form of expression for how religious liberty and government, as well as all of our liberties, are to be understood. It was known as the supreme law, as we have stated many times here on the Wright Flyer, from Section 2 of Article 6. So, when you look at the way that Oklahoma has handled this issue, and the way that the American Civil Liberties Union, or ACLU, has approached these separation of church and state cases, they are absolutely disregarding the type of context that the Founding Fathers considered when they included the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights. And it's important to see how it developed even by the time that we were approaching the Constitution itself. In a memorial and remonstrance against religious assessments from around June 20th, 1785, James Madison also said, "The civil rights of none shall be abridged on account of religious belief or worship, nor shall any national religion be established, nor shall the full and equal rights of conscience be in any manner or on any pretext infringed." So right there, you are seeing the expressed and overt context of how James Madison envisioned the separation of church and state. It was not to be that it would be completely stripped from every public building or government property, because that in and of itself is actually a pretext for infringement. And when you think of that, it clearly demonstrates that these radical atheists and the radical left in the United States have gone so far into the realm of atheism that it is dangerous, because it is infringing upon the right of the individual to express themselves and the ability to look at things in context. Because if you think that art, like the monument to the Ten Commandments, can be seen in a historical context as opposed to one that is wholly religious, then it should be allowed to stay. And this is a fine line that has to be walked, but it is not stating that the United States of America only accepts the Ten Commandments because it is a religious document, that's absurd, because it's not the way or the context in which it's being displayed. It is not saying that we have established Christianity as the religion of the United States. What it is saying is that the United States follows and adheres to a natural law system, and that the Ten Commandments is a type of natural law. Now, you can still follow the edicts of the Ten Commandments and not believe the law. Thou shalt not murder is the law of the land in every country, except for perhaps the most barbaric regions in the world, but even there, it is just a form of natural law that is important everywhere. It is stating that human life has value. And again, when we take this in context of what's happening, say, with Planned Parenthood and these groups that are pushing for death, it would seem, it seems that they don't want to admit that it is natural to protect life, because that puts them in a dangerous position if it were to be decided that abortion was murder. And of course, that was the law throughout the states for a very long time, which makes sense, because if you think about it, human life has value, and we can't just abridge that value for political expediency. What is important is that we have to continue to abide by and adhere to the principles of natural law as outlined in the United States Constitution to ensure that the government does not encroach upon our fundamental liberties and rights, because that is a major part of how this entire system works. Going back to the words of James Madison, we can see that he said in 1789 to a proposed amendment to the Constitution, and from the speech that he gave, he said, "Conscience is the most sacred of all property." Now stop and think about that for a moment. He is saying that the ability to express your conscience and to note and to acknowledge the natural law principles which govern the United States Constitution is a form of property. Your mind is your property. And that's why things such as the doctrine of political correctness are so dangerous, because it is attempting to strip you of your unalienable right to property, and your mind being your own property as well. So what we see is that separation of church and state has been blown completely out of proportion as to what was meant by the Founding Fathers at the time that the Constitution was adopted. Now, another argument that can be made, especially with reference to this, is that atheism can be viewed as a religion. Even though it is an absence of religion, it is almost as though these people are worshiping at an altar of absence. They're seeking to encroach upon the religious liberties of their fellow Americans because they feel so abhorrent to the expression of certain natural law principles, because they don't accept a natural law. Well, if that is the case, then how can you have a system that is wholly based on natural law if you don't believe in natural law? Therefore, they are presenting a real challenge to the United States Constitution, and they are not adhering to the principles of it. In fact, they are attempting to tear it apart. But that is not what is good, nor what would work for the United States of America. It will be a challenge to ensure that we continue to adhere by the principles and edicts of the First Amendment. But we have to. We have to, because if we don't, then they are going to replace it with anarchy and chaos. And part of what the problem is with these radical atheist groups is that they are completely intolerant. They are actually acting like the Church of England did during the colonial days when they imprisoned the Baptists for believing what they did. You can see it with the gay marriage issue and forcing those who have their own religious convictions to adhere to a policy adopted by the Supreme Court, which is not law in and of itself, but is applied to the laws that have already been written against their religious conscience. That, too, going back to that letter that James Madison wrote, saying that the dictates of conscience, to violate the dictates of conscience, is also to be frowned upon, because that, too, is oppressive. The idea of natural law in the United States is that sovereignty rests in the hands of the people. They delegate certain authorities and powers to the state governments, who then delegate certain powers and authorities to the federal government. And as you go up that tier, that ladder, if you will, the further away it gets from the individual, the less power it is supposed to have. That is just the hierarchical system of the United States Constitution. It is inherent in our country, how it works, how the government is to be established and to operate. So when you have these groups that do everything in their power to remove these symbols, which they argue are symbols of religion, all of a sudden you are facing a true sort of catastrophe that is detrimental to the country. Because the country itself has to have the ability for the people to express themselves freely. That is why the First Amendment takes the position that it does. And it also ties into the Ninth Amendment in so much as the way that the First Amendment's establishment of religion, or the Establishment Clause, is being applied, it's actually being applied in a way as to deprive the free exercise of religion from other people. And the Ninth Amendment says you cannot construe rights within the Constitution in a way to abridge or belittle or to demean or take away other rights. So we see again that through the power of judicial review, which cannot be found in the four corners of the United States Constitution, the courts have again assumed a power upon themselves and acted in an extra-constitutional fashion, which is prohibited. But the powers that be are completely out of touch on this. And I say this because they are falling into this trap lockstep. They seem to be completely unable to understand the context in which the separation of church and state was originally envisioned. Because if you start to say that government can have no religious symbols or no religious edicts, then you also are saying you have to have a government that is completely relative when it comes to morality. Now, moral relativism is a dangerous thing because it means that alien cultures can come in and change how the United States is supposed to function, and can take away the principles of liberty which were envisioned over 2 centuries ago. There is a reason that the United States Constitution is the longest running constitution in human history. It is because it is based on these firm principles of natural law, that the unalienable rights are endowed to us by our Creator, and that the government cannot create or destroy rights. But if you look at the goals of the radical left here in America today, that is exactly what they are attempting to do. And these steps that are being taken may appear as though they are small, unimportant, or don't have much impact on this entire issue, but it really does have a lasting impact. It is like killing a tiger through 1,000 cuts. And that is how this has played out. And that's why we have to be vigilant when it comes to all of this, because going again back to James Madison, he said, "We are teaching the world the great truth that governments do better without kings and nobles than with them. The merit will be doubled by the other lesson that religion flourishes in greater purity without than with the aid of government." So, looking at it in that context, we can see that Madison was concerned with, again, this notion of an official religion. Now, these monuments do not establish an official religion. They state certain values that can be found in religion, but it is not saying that the government itself has established a religion. And therefore, it really boils down to the free exercise of religion. And when you strip away these symbols, you are saying that just because it's a government thing, you can't express a religious belief. Well, no. That is why the free exercise clause is an integral part of the First Amendment. You cannot have one without the other. And that's what the left in this country is trying to do. They're trying to say that you can only have one and not the other, or selectively have one but not the other. And that's picking and choosing the law. And the United States is supposed to be a nation of laws, not of men. That means that it's supposed to apply equally to all. So, if the atheists are saying that we can have no religious symbols there, then it should also be that those that are there can't be taken away, because they are now putting the equal application of the law out of balance. That's the problem. This tyrannical notion that we have to have tolerance in everything is actually a form of intolerance. It is Orwellian in its scope and application. And the way that they have done this is truly staggering, because it is not good or decent. It is pushing an agenda, and that agenda is stripping people of their fundamental religious liberties and rights. And it's not just religious liberties and rights, because if you can take away from the free exercise of religion, it's not a far stretch that you can then take away from free speech. It opens the door to encroaching upon our Second Amendment rights to keep and bear arms. It establishes a very dangerous precedent which should never be embraced in the United States, or indeed in any free society. The entire purpose of the United States government was to ensure that our fundamental liberties are protected. But, just as we have unalienable rights, we are also endowed with the duty to protect those rights. Nothing ever really comes for free. It requires that we be vigilant and proactive in the defense of our sacred rights. And that is why we have the Second Amendment, because it is in there to ensure that we have the means and wherewithal to be able to defend our fundamental rights. Now, this may be very unpopular with the radical left, but they cannot escape the facts as they are presented and as they existed at the time of the ratification of the Constitution and later the Bill of Rights. It is why the Ninth Amendment, as little understood as it is as important as it is, because it delineates the purpose of what the rights are there for. It states that government cannot use the Bill of Rights or law or their enumerated powers to strip you of your rights. And the Supreme Court, via this power of judicial review, has gone completely beyond that. They are operating contrary to the Constitution, and that is also violative of the law of the United States. And you have to think, when James Madison said in that memorial and remonstrance against religious assessments, back in 1785, the civil rights of none shall be abridged. That means no one's civil rights, fundamental rights, unalienable rights, shall be abridged on account of religious belief or worship. And that would include lack of religious belief or worship. Because if you think about it, the atheists are acting out of a belief that there is no creator. That is, in and of itself, a form of religious belief. Whether they believe it or not, it is. And therefore, what they are doing is they are stripping the property, the most sacred of all property, that of conscience. Because conscience is what the Ten Commandments are speaking of. How to be a good person. And as a historical reflection of what law is, and what law is capable of. Yet, the problem is that they don't want history to be seen. And we can see this from the doctrine of political correctness, which works in tandem with this. Back in the summer, when they attempted to tear down the Southern Cross battle flag, it was, again, stating that in the name of tolerance, we have to destroy, and we have to ignore historical context. That opens the floodgates to destroying the Constitution. Because irrespective of its historical context, it is seen by them as oppressive. Why? Because it limits the scope, power, application, and authority of government. They believe that government is the end-all, be-all for solving all of the problems in the world. But that's simply not true. That's not the way the Founding Fathers intended the scope and application of government to work in the United States. And it's disingenuous the way that these radical minorities are going about implementing this policy. They are telling the majority that no, you can't display your beliefs at all. You cannot display the notion of there being a natural law system because it offends me. But that's not what conscience meant. And that's not how James Madison envisioned the so-called separation of church and state. Because he didn't want it to be that one group could abridge the rights of another. Simply by having the Ten Commandments as a monument, they are not abridging the rights of anyone else, because it is not an establishment of an official religion. It is a mere statement of what is applicable and how law works and how it has historically developed. But they don't want to get into this idea that there is a right and wrong, because then you can condemn certain behaviors that are practiced by these radical minority groups and state that it is abnormal or that it is not part of the proper context of how things work. And it's important to keep in mind that by changing the ability to present something in a certain context and generalizing in a blanket fashion is dangerous in and of itself as well. Because stamping out the ability to speak is tyrannical. And that's why I find it amazing that these government groups will sit there and project out that they don't want to allow a certain form of expression because it is either politically incorrect or there's been a fight over it, a legal fight, in this case with the ACLU, and therefore we're just going to take it all away. That is the incorrect response. The correct response would be, if you don't like this monument, then erect a monument of your own to express your viewpoints. Do not encroach upon the rights of others because you may find a certain depiction of something offensive. You don't have a right to freedom from religion. You have a right to hold whatever beliefs you wish, religiously speaking, so long as they don't encroach upon the rights of others. But that has been so totally flipped on its head that it's unrecognizable under this current system. And the way that the government has responded to this only emboldens and empowers that rabid and radical minority group that will, come hell or high water, do everything in their power to strip away something they don't like. But that is not a good way to govern. It does not reflect the actual edicts of government. And it certainly denies the natural law application of the United States Constitution. Why is it that one group is allowed to dictate to everyone how things are supposed to be on government property? Why is it that we have to bend to the will of those who, if you really look at most of their beliefs, are diametrically opposed to everything that the Constitution of the United States represents? We shouldn't have to do that, because that is not what America represents. Nevertheless, it's something that has been with us for a long time. And these actors are only getting more rabid. And the reason they do is because we cave. We give them what they want. And they have these beliefs because they want to seek some sort of acknowledgement or acceptance of their views, irrespective of whether what they're doing is encroaching upon the views or beliefs of others. And of course, that in and of itself is dangerous and tyrannical. And that's why I think it's so important when James Madison said, "It is the duty of every man to render to the Creator such homage and such only as he believes to be acceptable to him." This duty is precedent, both in order of time and in degree of obligation, to the claims of civil society. So, they want to say that a civil society would be the type that would deny you the ability to speak for yourself, would deny you the ability to have something in a historical context if it may have anything that remotely reflects religion. But if they were truly tolerant, they would allow it and find other ways to express it as per their individual duty. But they don't seem to be able to separate these issues in their minds. They can't, because it means that they must then give credence and credit to something that is not their own. And if you really think about it, it is a form of selfishness on their part. The way that they lash out is not necessarily a good form of behavior. Look, they can believe whatever they want, but to tell somebody that they can't express their beliefs, or that you can't have certain depictions or religious statements which are not an establishment of an official religion, they are perverting the First Amendment and how it applies. And if we allow them to do that, then they can pervert and obfuscate and slowly destroy every part of the United States Constitution. And that is the duty of every American to avoid. We are endowed with these rights, coached with, or couched with, the duty and responsibility to stand up for them. And by failing to do so, we have allowed this type of destructive behavior to run rampant in the United States. If we say that these radical fringe groups can have their way with everything, then nothing can be held as sacred or valuable, because somebody, somewhere, will disagree with it, or somehow find offense in it. And if you think about it, the doctrine of political correctness, which this is all part of, is that kind of cancerous belief that is detrimental to the government. And not just to the government, but to our rights. Because government is now being wielded as a weapon to deny us rights. And that is the very antithesis of what the Founding Fathers envisioned when they created this country over 200 years ago. And if we are not careful, they will be able to completely redefine what it means to be an American. Folks, if they take away your liberty, they leave you with nothing. They strip you of everything. All things will then be subject to the control of the edicts of a few. And that is totally and absolutely opposite of what the United States represents, as is embodied in the United States Constitution. So we have to be proactive. And that's why we have to look at these things. And the absurdity of it all is that they are winning because people are afraid of being offensive. But folks, anything and everything can be offensive depending upon context. And that's why they want to blur and obfuscate what context means. They want to deny that you have the ability to state something or to put something in context. Because if they are the sole arbiters of what context is, they can force their views on everyone through their narrow view of context. And that is why Jeremy and I have always said that it is crucial, absolutely imperative, that every American have a working and fluent understanding of the United States Constitution. Because if you lack that, just think, if some other radical minority group were to come to power, they could use this kind of influence that has developed to strip away your rights from you. So irrespective of what your religious beliefs are, you should be concerned when the government capitulates to the demands of these rabid and radical minority groups, because it is not a far or wild stretch of the imagination to think that your point of view may become out of vogue at some point in the near future. And should that happen, what protections will you have against this kind of jackbooted thuggery, this despotism and tyranny of the minority? It's why the United States is not a democracy. Because a true democracy is completely open to tyranny of the minority. They can paralyze the actions of government, and for the better good, by their own twisted and radical agenda. That's why it is so important to stress the fact that we are actually a representative republic with democratic elections. Because if we don't have the representative capacity to protect the interests of both the minority and the majority, then you do have an opening for tyranny to gain a foothold in the land of the free. And they will whittle away at all of our fundamental rights and liberties until we are completely stripped of them. And when that happens, tyranny and despotism will be the supreme law of the land instead of the United States Constitution. And that is why we have always said that it is so important to have this working knowledge of the United States Constitution. So, I think we have about covered everything with respect to the United States Constitution and the application of the separation of church and state, that doctrine. I'm hoping that I have left you with a good understanding of it, and you should take this opportunity to go back and review the First Amendment and look up some of the writings of James Madison, because it will help shed light on how this is to be properly construed or interpreted. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, this is your Captain Randy Wright. We are now beginning our descent, so sit back and relax. I'm sending the flight attendant around for one last round of alcohol. Thank you for joining us. We couldn't do this without you. It's been a pleasure. See you next time.